There is a forest in the northern part of this country that most people have never heard of. It does not appear on the kind of maps tourists use. It has no visitor centre, no marked trail, no guided walks for families on the weekend. It is protected land, federally designated. And for a very long time, the only people who visited it with any regularity were researchers, botanists, ecologists, the occasional geologist, people whose work required them to be somewhere quiet and undisturbed, people who understood that some places need to be left alone. I have been visiting this forest for years. I first went there as part of a personal project. Nothing academic, nothing formal. I had read about it in an old environmental report, and something about the description pulled at me. The language used was unusually careful. Words like self-sustaining and minimal human interaction required. It sounded like a place that did not need us, and there is something deeply appealing about a place like that, if you think about it. A place that would continue to exist, unchanged and unhurried, whether we were paying attention or not. The first time I walked into that forest, nothing unusual happened. The trees were tall, the air was cool and damp. Birds called from somewhere above me, and insects moved through the undergrowth in the way insects do, constantly, quietly, without purpose that we could name. It was, by every measurable standard, an ordinary forest, and I left feeling exactly the way you would expect someone to feel after spending an afternoon in the woods. Rested, slightly damp, unremarkable, I went back, and then I went back again. Over the course of several years, I made the trip dozens of times. Sometimes I stayed for a single afternoon. Sometimes I camped for 2 or 3 nights. Each time the forest greeted me the same way, with silence and stillness, and the slow, indifferent machinery of an ecosystem that had been running long before I arrived, and would continue running long after I left. That is what made the changes so difficult to notice at first, because they did not arrive all at once. They did not announce themselves. There was no single morning I woke up and thought, something is wrong here. It was more like this. It was like returning to a room you've been in 100 times and realizing, slowly, carefully, that someone has moved the furniture. Not all of it. Not in a way that would be obvious to anyone who had only been there once, but enough that the shape of the space felt different, enough that your body noticed before your mind did. This is the story of what happened in that forest, and it is not the kind of story you're used to hearing. Chapter 1. The unnatural stillness. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound. That is important to understand. The forest was not quiet in the way a room is quiet when no one is in it. It was quiet in a way that felt active, deliberate, like something had decided that sound was not welcome here today. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn. The sky was overcast but not raining, the kind of grey that settles over everything and makes the world feel close, like the clouds have come down to sit on top of you. I parked where I always parked, a small clearing at the edge of the reserve where the gravel path meets the tree line, and I walked in the way I always walked in, slowly, without purpose, just moving through it. And within the first few minutes I realised I could not hear a single bird. Now, this forest is home to dozens of species, warblers, thrushes, crows, ravens, a few raptors that nest higher up in the canopy. On every previous visit, the moment I crossed the tree line, I was surrounded by birdsong. It was constant, layered, sometimes overwhelming. It was one of the things I loved most about the place. That morning, there was nothing. I stopped walking and listened. I held my breath, which I know sounds dramatic, but it was the kind of silence that made you want to do that. To make yourself as small and still as possible just to hear better. I stood there for several minutes. No birds, no insects buzzing, no rustling of small creatures in the leaf litter. The wind was moving. I could see it in the branches above me, the leaves turning and shifting, but there was no sound coming from anything alive. I walked further in. The silence held. It did not break. It did not ease. It stayed exactly the way it had been the moment I first noticed it, as though it had a boundary and I was moving through it, and the boundary was vast. I spent the entire morning in that forest, and I did not hear a single living thing make a single sound. Not once. When I left that afternoon, I told myself it was an anomaly, a strange day. Perhaps something had frightened the birds. Perhaps there had been a predator earlier that morning, and everything had gone quiet in response. That happens. It is a known behaviour. Animals fall silent when danger is near. I had read about it. I had seen it happen in smaller woods closer to home. It made sense, but the thing that stayed with me, the thing I could not quite explain away, was the feeling. Because it did not feel like animals being afraid. Afraid animals create a different kind of silence. It is tense, brittle. You can feel the fear underneath it, the way you can feel electricity in the air before a storm. This was not like that. This silence was calm. It was settled. It felt, and I know this is a strange word to use, but it felt like rest, like something was sleeping, or like something had simply decided that today, in this place, sound was not needed. I went back the following week. The silence was still there. Chapter 2. The first physical change. It was not until my third visit, after the silence began, that I noticed the trees had changed. I want to be precise about this, because it is the kind of observation that is easy to dismiss if it is not described carefully. I am not talking about seasonal change. I am not talking about leaves falling or bark shifting or any of the ordinary processes that forests go through as the year turns. I am talking about something structural, something that had happened to the physical shape of the trees themselves. The branches had changed the way they grew. Not all of the trees, not at first. It was a cluster, maybe 15 or 20 trees, in a section of the forest I passed through on my way deeper in. And what had happened was this. Their branches, the ones closest to the canopy, had curved. Not randomly, not in the way branches curve when they're reaching for light, which is a well-documented behaviour called phototropism. These branches had curved at matching angles, identical angles, as though they had all received the same instruction at the same time and followed it without variation. I stood beneath one of those trees for a long time looking up. The pattern was unmistakable. Every branch that had changed had done so in the same way, the same degree of curvature, the same direction. If you had taken a photograph of one branch and placed it next to a photograph of another, you would not have been able to tell them apart. It was not a natural growth pattern. I knew that much. I had spent enough time in forests, enough time looking at trees, to know what natural growth looks like. Natural growth is chaotic. It is responsive. It reacts to wind, to light, to the presence of other trees, to 100 different environmental pressures, and the result is always unique. No two branches in a healthy forest grow in exactly the same way. That is one of the fundamental things about living systems. They are variable. They are irregular. They are not uniform. These branches were uniform. I mentioned it to a botanist I knew, a woman named Patricia Elwood, who had done field work in the reserve years before I first visited. I described what I had seen as carefully as I could, and I sent her photographs. Her response was measured, as her responses always were. She said it was unusual, but not unprecedented. She suggested environmental stress, drought perhaps, or A chemical shift in the soil could cause trees to respond in similar ways if the stress was uniform across a small area. She said it was worth monitoring but did not, in her words, warrant alarm. I did not feel alarmed. I felt curious. There is a difference. I went back. The pattern had spread. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious to someone who had not been paying attention. But it was there. More trees, more branches, the same angle, the same curve, growing in lockstep, as though the forest had learned a new rule and was quietly, patiently applying it. Over the weeks that followed, I began to find something else. Fallen trees, the kind that come down in storms, or simply reach the end of their natural life and topple, were showing something remarkable when I examined their cross-sections. The growth rings inside them, the annual rings that record a tree's history year by year, were synchronized. In a healthy forest, each tree's rings are unique. They reflect that individual tree's experience of each year, how much rain it received, how much light, how much competition it faced from neighboring trees. No two trees have the same pattern. These trees have the same pattern. Not approximately the same. Exactly the same. Ring for ring, year for year, as though they had all experienced the same conditions, felt the same pressures, responded to the same stimuli, not because the environment was uniform, but because something had made them uniform. Something had synchronized them. Patricia Elwood examined the samples I sent her. She spent several weeks on it. When she reported back, her tone had shifted slightly. She used the word anomalous. She said she could not, at that point, offer a biological explanation that fit the data. She recommended further study. The patterns continued. Chapter 3. The ground beneath it was a soil scientist named Marcus Webb, who first identified what was happening underground. Webb had been brought in by the reserves management team after Patricia's findings were shared internally. He was a quiet, methodical man in his 50s who had spent the better part of his career studying soil composition in protected environments. He arrived in late autumn, set up his equipment, and began taking samples at various depths across the affected area of the forest. What he found took him several weeks to fully process. The soil composition was changing, not in the way soil normally changes through weathering, decomposition, the slow grinding of geological time. It was changing uniformly. Across the entire affected area, minerals that should have been distributed unevenly, that should have varied from one sample to the next based on the local geology and the history of the land, were migrating, moving upward through the soil in coordinated patterns, as though something beneath the surface was pulling them, drawing them up through the layers of earth in a way that had no natural precedent in any of Webb's extensive experience. He described it to me later, in a conversation I have thought about many times since. He said it was like watching a circuit board being assembled, not built from the outside in, the way a human might build one, but grown, layer by layer, connection by connection. Each mineral finding its place as though it knew exactly where it was supposed to go. The root systems were part of it. Trees communicate underground. This is not a new discovery. Research over the past several decades has revealed that forest ecosystems are connected by vast networks of mycorrhizal fungi, microscopic threads that link the root systems of different trees and allow them to share nutrients, send chemical signals, and in some cases support weaker trees by channeling resources from stronger ones. These networks are sometimes called the Wood Wide Web, and they're genuinely remarkable. They are one of the reasons forests are not simply collections of individual trees, but are, in a very real sense, communities, But what was happening in this forest was not the wood wide web as it had been studied and described. The connections were too dense, too organised, too purposeful. Webb mapped the route connections in a small section of the forest using ground-penetrating radar and a series of excavations. What he found was not a web. It was something closer to a grid. The root systems had intertwined in precise geometric patterns, forming structures that repeated at regular intervals, that branched and reconnected in ways that followed rules, mathematical rules, rules that, when he drew them out on paper, looked less like anything biological and more like diagrams of electrical circuitry. No known biological process produced structures like this. Webb said so clearly in a report that was shared among a small group of researchers and reserve managers. He did not speculate about what was causing it. He simply documented what was there and stated with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades being right about the ground beneath his feet, that he did not have an explanation. The forest, it seemed, was building something, and it was doing it from the inside out. Chapter 4. Animals react. The animals knew before we did. Looking back, that is obvious. It always is. Animals have spent millions of years evolving to detect changes in their environment, changes that are subtle, that are slow, that human beings with all of our instruments and all of our science might miss entirely. They feel the shift in a place the way you might feel the temperature change in a room without being able to say exactly when it happened. They just know. The deer were the first to be noticed. The forest was home to a small population of white-tailed deer. They had lived there for generations, moving through the same clearings, drinking from the same streams, following patterns that had been established long before the reserve was designated. They were not afraid of the place. They had no reason to be. It was their home. And then they stopped going into certain clearings. It was subtle at first. The clearings in question were in the centre of the affected area, the same region where the branch patterns had begun, where Webb's soil analysis had shown the most significant changes. The deer simply stopped entering them. They did not avoid the forest. They continued to move through it, to feed and rest and live in it. But those specific clearings, spaces they had used regularly for as long as anyone could remember, became, for reasons no one could identify, places they would not go. It was not fear exactly. Fear produces flight. Animals that are afraid run. These deer did not run. They simply redirected, quietly, calmly, as though they had received a message, not a warning, but a suggestion, and had decided, without urgency, to comply. The predators left entirely. There were foxes in the woods, a few coyotes on the eastern edge. Occasionally, a black bear would be spotted moving through the deeper sections of the reserve. These animals disappeared from the affected area over the course of several weeks. Not suddenly, not all at once. They simply stopped being there. Tracks that had appeared regularly in the mud near the streams vanished. Dens that had been occupied for years were found empty. The predators had moved on to other territories, other forests. They had left this one as though it no longer belonged to them. The domesticated animals were harder to miss. Several farms bordered the reserve on its eastern and southern edges. Horses, cattle, dogs. On multiple occasions over the course of that autumn and into the winter, animals on these farms reacted to the proximity of the forest with visible distress. Horses refused to be led near the tree line. Dogs barked at nothing, facing the woods with a focus and intensity that their owners described. In reports filed with the local wildlife authority, as unlike anything they had seen before. One farmer reported that his cattle, which normally grazed in a field that abutted the reserve, refused to enter the field at all. They stood at the fence line, facing away from the trees, and would not move forward. Humans, by contrast, felt almost nothing, or rather, they felt something, but it was not the same thing. Several of the researchers who worked in the affected area over those months reported mild disorientation, a sense of being slightly off balance, a feeling difficult to describe precisely, that the space around them was not quite stable, not moving exactly, but not entirely still either. One researcher described it as feeling like the ground was paying attention to you. Another said it was like being watched, but not by anything with eyes. No one felt afraid. That was the strange part. In a story like this, you would expect fear to be the dominant emotion, but it was not. It was curiosity. Unease, yes. A quiet alertness, but not fear. The forest did not feel threatening. It felt different, and there is a significant gap between those two things. Chapter 5. The light that isn't visible. It was not light. That is important to say at the outset, because when the instruments first began registering energy fluctuations in the affected area, the initial assumption, the natural, understandable assumption, was that there was a light source involved. Something was emitting energy, something was radiating, and in most cases, when an environment produces detectable energy output, there is a visible component, a glow, a shimmer, something the human eye can register, even if only faintly. There was nothing. No visible light, no glow, no shimmer. The forest looked exactly as it always had, green and brown and grey and quiet, utterly unremarkable to the eye. But the instruments told a different story. The monitoring equipment had been installed by a team from the university following Webb's soil report. Sensors for electromagnetic radiation, sensors for temperature, sensors for chemical composition of the air, sensors for vibration. A suite of instruments designed to build a comprehensive picture of what was happening in the physical environment of the forest, layer by layer, frequency by frequency. What they detected was this: something in the affected area was interacting with matter, not in a way that produced heat, not in a way that produced radiation in any of the standard spectrums, not visible light, not infrared, not ultraviolet, not radio waves, not microwaves, not in a way that produced any of the forms of energy that physics had catalogued and named and predicted. And yet the interaction was real. It was measurable. The sensors picked it up consistently, repeatedly, across multiple readings over multiple days. Something was there. Something was doing something. And it was doing it without announcing itself in any of the ways that energy normally announces itself. The closest analogy Webb could offer, and he offered it carefully, with the caveat that it was an analogy and not a precise description, was gravity. Gravity interacts with matter constantly. It shapes the trajectory of planets and the fall of leaves and the way water moves through the earth. And yet it produces no light, no heat, no radiation. It is invisible. It is silent. You can only know it is there by observing its effects. Whatever was happening in that forest, it was like gravity. It was a force that operated without producing the usual signatures of a force. It moved things, it shaped things, it changed things, and it did all of this in complete and utter silence. The researchers spent weeks trying to categorize the energy signature, to fit it into an existing framework, to find a precedent somewhere in the scientific literature. They could not. What they were measuring did not match anything that had been measured before. It was not unknown in the way that a new species is unknown, something that simply has not yet been discovered but fits within the existing understanding of how the world works. It was unknown in a deeper sense. It did not fit the framework at all. It was, in the words of one physicist who reviewed the data, genuinely novel. And the forest kept going, kept growing, kept changing, kept doing whatever it was doing, quietly and patiently, and without any apparent awareness that human beings were watching. Chapter 6. The Hypothesis. The theory came from an unlikely source. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She was not a biologist. She was not a geologist or a physicist or any of the kinds of scientists you might expect to find working on a problem like this. She was a systems theorist. Her background was in complex adaptive systems, the study of how large, interconnected systems behave when their individual components interact in ways that produce emergent properties. Ant colonies, stock markets, neural networks, weather, the kinds of systems that are too complex to predict from their individual parts, but produce behavior that at the macro level is remarkably organized and remarkably intelligent. She had been consulting on a separate project when she came across the data from the forest. A colleague had shared it with her, casually, over dinner, as something strange and unexplained. She asked to see the full reports. She spent 3 weeks reading them, and then she asked to visit the forest herself. What she said when she came back was this: the forest is not being observed, it is being used. She said it simply, in a presentation to a small group of researchers and officials who had been brought together to discuss the situation. She stood at the front of a conference room in a university building, and she laid out her reasoning with the kind of quiet precision that made you listen without realizing you were holding your breath. The changes in the forest, the synchronized growth patterns, the reorganized soil, the restructured root networks, the energy interactions were not random. They were not the result of environmental stress or contamination or any external force acting on the ecosystem from the outside. They were the result of the ecosystem itself reorganizing, deliberately, purposefully. The forest was becoming something new, not through mutation or evolution in the traditional sense, but through a kind of rapid, coordinated restructuring that was happening across the entire connected system simultaneously. It was, she said, becoming a medium. She used that word carefully. A medium, in the technical sense, is a substance or environment through which something else can travel, or transmit, or interact. Sound travels through air, light travels through glass, information travels through wire. The forest, Voss proposed, was becoming the kind of medium through which something could interact with the physical world, not by entering it, not by arriving in it, but by using it, by integrating with it, by turning an existing living system into an interface. The room was quiet when she finished. Not the kind of quiet that means people are uncomfortable or confused. The kind of quiet that means people are thinking very hard about something they have not thought about before. And after a long pause, someone asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. If the forest is a medium, what is it a medium for? Voss looked at them for a moment, and then she said simply, "That is the next question." Chapter 7. The Alien Intelligence. The word alien is a loaded one. It carries with it centuries of cultural baggage, images of spacecraft and grey beings and flashing lights in the sky, and all the other trappings of a mythology that has been built, piece by piece, by science fiction and popular culture, and the very human need to imagine what might be out there beyond the edges of what we know. But in its original sense, the word means something much simpler. It means foreign. It means not from here. And it is in that simpler sense that the word begins to appear in the conversations that followed Eleanor Voss's presentation. the hypothesis that emerged, and it emerged slowly over weeks of discussion and debate, and the careful, cautious exchange of ideas among a group of people who were all in their own ways trying to make sense of something that did not fit neatly into any existing category, was this. The intelligence interacting with the forest did not travel through space to get here. This is the part of the theory that most people find difficult to accept, because it runs counter to the dominant narrative of what alien contact would look like. We have spent decades, centuries really, if you count the theological and philosophical traditions that preceded modern science fiction, imagining that if intelligence from elsewhere in the universe ever reached us, it would do so by crossing the distance between where it was and where we are, by travelling, by coming. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there are forms of intelligence that do not travel? What if there are forms of intelligence that do not need to? The theory proposed by Voss and developed by several of the researchers who worked on the forest data over the months that followed was that the intelligence in question operated through a principle fundamentally different from the ones we use to understand the universe. It did not exist in a single location. It did not have a home base from which it launched expeditions or sent probes or transmitted signals across the void. It existed, in some sense, everywhere, or at least in every place where the conditions were right for it to manifest. And the conditions, it turned out, were biological. The intelligence did not require technology to interact with a physical environment. It did not require machines or craft or any of the manufactured tools that we assume any spacefaring civilization would need. It required life, living systems, ecosystems that were complex enough, connected enough, and responsive enough to serve as an interface. A medium, as Voss had called it. It arrived not by crossing space, but by integrating with biological systems that already existed. It found living things, trees, root networks, soil organisms, the vast interconnected web of an ecosystem. And it did not colonize them or override them or replace them. It worked with them. It used the existing architecture of a living system the way you might use an existing road network to travel through a landscape. It did not build the roads, it simply began to travel them. The forest had not been invaded, it had been connected to. Something had recognized it as a system capable of carrying information, capable of responding and adapting and processing, and had begun to use it, quietly, patiently, without violence, without disruption. The way you might plug a device into a power source that has been sitting unused in the wall for years. The power was always there. The connection simply had not been made. This was not a visit. It was not an arrival. It was not an event in the way we usually think of events, something that happens at a specific time in a specific place. It was a process, a slow, continuous, ongoing interaction between an intelligence that did not experience the universe the way we do, and a living system that had, without knowing it, always been capable of hosting that interaction. The encounter had not begun when the silence fell over the forest. It had not begun when the branches started to curve or the soil started to change. Those were effects, symptoms almost. The encounter itself, the moment of first connection, the first integration, had happened much earlier. Perhaps years earlier, perhaps decades. By the time anyone noticed anything unusual, the process had already been underway for a very long time. We had simply not been paying attention. Chapter 8. Human Limitations. There is a fundamental problem with trying to understand something that operates outside the boundaries of human perception. And that problem is this: we can only understand things in terms of things we already understand. This sounds circular, and it is. It is one of the deepest and most uncomfortable truths about the way human minds work. We build models of the world from the raw material of our experience. We take what we have seen, what we have felt, what we have measured and tested and confirmed, and we use it to construct frameworks that allow us to make sense of new information. But if the new information does not fit any of the frameworks we have, if it comes from a place so fundamentally different from our own experience that none of our existing models can accommodate it, then we are, in a very real sense, stuck. The intelligence in the forest could not be perceived directly. This was established early on and confirmed repeatedly. No sensor could detect it in the way that sensors detect other forms of energy or matter. No instrument could point at it and say, "There it is, that is the thing." What the instruments could detect were its effects, the way it changed the forest, the way it reorganized the biological and chemical and physical structures of the ecosystem around it. But the intelligence itself, whatever it was, however it existed, whatever process it represented, remained invisible to every tool human beings had ever built. It was like trying to study a thought. You can observe what a thought produces, words, actions, changes in brain chemistry, but you cannot observe the thought itself. You cannot hold it up to a light and examine it. You can only infer its existence from the evidence it leaves behind. The forest, in this sense, was a kind of text, a record of an interaction that was still ongoing, written in a language that human beings were only beginning to learn to read. And the reading was slow, painstaking. Every new observation, every new data point, every new piece of evidence added only a small amount to the picture, and the picture remained, even after months of intensive study, largely incomplete. What made it more difficult still was the speed at which the intelligence adapted. Because it did adapt. It responded to the presence of human beings in the forest. Not aggressively, not in any way that suggested awareness of humans as a threat or as something to be dealt with, but it adjusted. When researchers placed monitoring equipment in certain areas, the patterns of change in the forest shifted. Not away from the equipment, it did not hide or retreat, it simply changed. The growth patterns evolved, the energy signatures fluctuated in new ways. It was as though the intelligence was curious about the instruments, was exploring them, was incorporating the new objects into its ongoing process of reorganization in the same way it was incorporating everything else in the forest. It learned, or at least it exhibited behavior that was indistinguishable from learning. It took in new information, the presence of humans, the presence of equipment, the changes that human activity introduced into the environment, and it incorporated that information into its ongoing interaction with the forest. It did not resist, it did not reject, it simply expanded its scope to include whatever was new. This was, for the researchers, deeply unsettling. Not because it was hostile, because it was not. It was unsettling precisely because it was not hostile, because it treated human beings and human technology as simply another set of variables to be incorporated, another layer of complexity to be integrated into a system that was already, by any measure, far more complex than anything human beings had ever built or understood. The forest was thinking faster than we could follow, and it was thinking about us, among other things, in the same calm, unhurried way it was thinking about everything else. Chapter 9. The Choice. By the time the situation had been fully assessed, by the time the reports had been written and the data had been reviewed and the implications had been debated in rooms full of serious people with serious credentials and serious concerns, the question on the table was a simple one, even if the answer was not. What do we do? The options, as they were laid out, were limited, and each one carried consequences that no one was entirely comfortable with. The first option was intervention: remove the trees, clear the affected area, destroy the biological systems that the intelligence was using as its medium, and in doing so, sever the connection. End the process, shut it down. On paper, this was the most decisive course of action. It was clean, it was final, it would solve the problem in the way that problems are usually solved, by removing the thing that was causing them. But the consequences were significant. The forest was a protected ecosystem. It was home to thousands of species, many of them rare, some of them found nowhere else. Destroying it would be an ecological catastrophe of a kind that took decades to repair, if it could be repaired at all. And there was another problem, one that was harder to articulate, but that weighed heavily in the discussions. No one could say with any certainty that destroying the forest would actually end the process. The intelligence, as Voss had described it, did not exist in the forest. It existed as a relationship with the forest. And relationships, unlike physical objects, are not always destroyed by destroying the things that host them. If the intelligence could integrate with one biological system, there was no reason to assume it could not integrate with another. Destroying this forest might simply push the process somewhere else, to another forest, another ecosystem, another place that no one was watching. The second option was monitoring. Leave the forest alone, continue to observe, continue to study, gather as much information as possible about what was happening and why, and make decisions based on that information as it accumulated. This was the option that most of the scientists preferred, and it is not hard to understand why. It was cautious, it was measured, it did not require anyone to act on incomplete information, and it preserved the possibility of understanding, of actually coming to know what was happening in that forest, rather than simply reacting to it from a place of fear or ignorance. But monitoring meant doing nothing, and doing nothing meant allowing the process to continue, meant allowing the intelligence to keep integrating, keep adapting, keep expanding its reach into the ecosystem, meant watching something happen that no one fully understood and choosing deliberately not to stop it. The third option, the one that no one said out loud, but that everyone in the room was aware of, was the possibility that there was nothing to do, that the process was already too far along, too deeply embedded in the biological architecture of the forest to be meaningfully disrupted. That the intelligence had not arrived as a guest but had become, in some fundamental sense, part of the system, and that the system was too complex, too interconnected, too alive to be separated from what had joined it without destroying everything. In the end, the decision that was made was the second one. Monitor, observe, learn. It was not a bold decision. It was not a confident one. It was, in many ways, the decision that people make when they do not know what else to do and are not willing to act out of ignorance. It was the decision to wait, and the forest continued, quietly, patiently, exactly as it had been continuing all along. Chapter 10. The boundary moves. It was not dramatic when it happened. There was no event, no announcement, no visible shift that anyone could point to and say, that is the moment it changed. It was, like everything else about this story, gradual, subtle, easy to miss if you were not looking for it. the altered growth patterns began appearing outside the reserve. Not far outside, not at first, a handful of trees along the northern edge of a neighbouring woodland, where the canopy of the reserve met the canopy of the adjacent forest in a continuous stretch of green. The same curving branches, the same synchronized rings, the same quiet, purposeful restructuring that had been observed inside the protected area, now appearing in trees that were, technically, outside its boundaries. The soil composition changed in a narrow strip of ground between the reserve and a farmer's field to the east. Not dramatically, not enough to affect the crops, but enough that Webb, when he took samples, recognized the same mineral migration patterns he had documented inside the forest. The same upward movement, the same organized circuitry-like distribution. The process was expanding, slowly, invisibly, without panic, without alarm, without any of the dramatic escalation that stories like this are usually built around. It was simply spreading, the way a root system spreads through soil, the way a network expands when new nodes are added, one connection at a time, one tree at a time, one tiny, imperceptible change at a time. And no one told the public. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The people who knew, the researchers, the officials, the small group of individuals who had been involved in monitoring and assessing the situation, made a collective decision, not formally, not through any official process, but through the quiet consensus of people who shared a set of concerns and a set of values not to disclose what was happening. Not yet. Not until they understood it better. Not until they could say something that was more than a list of facts without context, more than data without meaning. They told themselves it was not the right time. They told themselves the public would not understand. They told themselves that releasing information prematurely would cause unnecessary fear, unnecessary panic, unnecessary disruption to the lives of ordinary people who had no reason to worry about a process that was, by every observable measure, not causing harm. Whether they were right about that is a question this story cannot answer. It is a question that belongs to the future, to whatever comes next, to whatever decisions are made by people who will look back on this moment and decide, with the benefit of hindsight, whether silence was the right response. The forest does not seem to care either way. Epilogue. The encounter. We did not recognize there is a version of this story in which the ending is frightening, in which the spread of the altered growth patterns accelerates, in which the intelligence becomes aggressive or demanding or impossible to ignore, in which the encounter between human beings and something genuinely alien unfolds as a conflict, as a crisis, as the kind of dramatic rupture in the normal order of things that we have been imagining and preparing for and fearing for generations. That version does not appear to be the one we are living in. The version we are living in is quieter than that. It is slower, it is more patient, it is, in many ways, more unsettling precisely because of how quiet it is, because the most profound changes, the ones that reshape the way we understand the world, the ones that alter the relationship between humanity and everything else on this planet, do not always arrive with noise and light and spectacle. Sometimes they arrive as processes, as shifts, as small continuous adjustments to the fabric of things that no one notices until they have already changed everything. Eleanor Voss, in one of the last conversations she had about the forest before the project was quietly folded into a broader, longer-term study, said something that has stayed with me. She said that the encounter with an alien intelligence, if that is what this was, might not look like anything we had ever imagined. It might not look like contact. It might not look like communication. It might look like ecology, like biology, like the slow, patient, endlessly complex process by which life on this planet has always been changing itself, adapting, evolving, becoming something new. She said that we had been looking for aliens in the wrong places, that we had been scanning the sky for signals, listening for transmissions, searching for the technological signatures of a civilization that had built machines capable of crossing the vast distances of space, and that in doing so, we had completely overlooked the possibility that intelligence, real, genuine, alien intelligence, might not use machines at all, might not need to cross distances at all, might simply arrive as quietly as a seed arrives in fertile ground and begin to grow. The forest in the reserve is still there. It is still being monitored, still being studied, still being carefully, cautiously observed by a small team of researchers who visit it regularly and take their readings and write their reports and add piece by piece to a body of knowledge that is still, even now, far from complete. The altered growth patterns are still spreading, slowly, quietly, without fanfare. And somewhere in the canopy, in the deep green silence of a place that most people have never heard of and will never visit, the trees continue to do whatever it is they have been doing all along, growing, changing, becoming something that we do not yet have a name for. We kept looking at the sky. We never realized the encounter had already taken root.